Hello everybody, and it's a pleasure to be virtually here to present my video entitled Challenging Centric Imaginaries in Contemporary Music Studio Practices, Exploring Digital Instrument Playabilities for Traditional Musics. In this video presentation, I seek to explore the notion of centrism in musical instruments playabilities by providing a demonstration of contemporary studio practices in writing music as well as playing and recording digital and hybrid music instruments in quote-unquote traditional musical styles, while exploring established genre-hybridisms such as world fusion and contemporary local forms and musical philosophies such as world music 2.0. But there is a difference between world music, traditional music, and traditional forms of playing music. And it is the last of the three that has enticed me for so long, motivating me to ask more questions and explore the potentialities that arise from the intertwining of traditional playabilities and technological advancements. Therefore, in this video presentation, I attempt to demonstrate in action the role that contemporary MIDI controllers and electroacoustic instruments can have on the emulation of playabilities found in traditional instruments that cannot be co-opted from a simple MIDI keyboard or pad controller. When aligned with debates concerning the dominance of Eurological or Eurogenetic paradigms, this presentation stands as a proposition that modern controllers and electroacoustic instruments can indeed play a part in pulling away from long-standing canons and pervasive musical worldviews resulting from the hegemony of European art music when considered as an institutionalized barometer with which quality, authenticity, and value are ascertained. Some 20 years later, questions such as the one posited by Born and Hesmondahl can still be used to explore contemporary contexts of text and internet-driven musical creation, production, and expression, thus expanding their original scope when construed from the standpoint of analyzing samenesses between Western music, world music, and their electronic others. Furthermore, if we extrapolate and transport these questions to the domain of organology, cannot the same questions be asked regarding aesthetics, boundaries, appropriations, meta-classifications, and cultures with digital instruments, both physical and virtual? Can we consider the playability of musical instruments as belonging solely to their originating physical forms, or can we remix them into digital instruments, play them in controllers, and maintain a semblance of authenticity or identity even? What are authenticity and identity in a rapidly changing environment? In order to explore these questions, I intend to reconnoiter the dimension of musical instrument playability as a means with which to explore the juxtaposition of technology and tradition in the musical scape, and hopefully demonstrate how, rather than antagonistic, both traditional and tech-based forms of playing instruments, here termed as playabilities, can go hand in hand and be worthy of further exploratory development. It is important to consider that instruments' playabilities are not wholly or directly translatable per se, as physical limitations such as size, material response, reverberation, dynamic amplitude, etc. impose rules of engagement in highly effective sonic output, be it analog or digital. In a manner, individual styles of playing are individuated translations of the central narrative that surrounds a musical instrument, such as its role in the history, place, culture, and function in the society of peoples in a given place. What I mean is that to the instrument's narrative, we must also add the instrumentalist's personal narrative, i.e., how he or she translates canonical assumptions of meaning and representation into an individuated language through the instrument's playability. Another way of looking at this would be to consider forms of playing as lexicon and language through which the instrumentalist expresses his or her personal voice, read tastes, preferences, and even opinions on aesthetics and meaning, much as we do when we speak, all similarly yet differently from each other. Therefore, it is my invested interest to spend time researching forms of translating the translation, in which the form of playing a musical instrument can be translated into another in the digital realm or in hybrid form, which allows for an instrumentalist to transport their skill and personalized musical language in an instrument to a second one, which emulates the sonic output of the first, as well as the touchabilities traditionally required to exact the sounds from the originating instrument, and ultimately go beyond, thus opening further creative potentials. Traditional forms of playing, improvising, composing, logicalizing, and interpreting are challenged by hyper-instruments, and the resulting dichotomy that pits new versus old yields a series of interesting questions. What exactly is musical tradition, and how is it localized? Does it belong to a peoples, a nation, or country, or even a region of the globe? Is it not divisive to consider that only certain folk with certain upbringings within determined cultural contexts are worthy, for lack of a better word, of diving into experiencing and wallowing in the artistic beauty of a given musical tradition or instrument? Beyond these considerations, we must give in to the evidence that the cultural contexts of playability in which the musical instruments have been traditionally used have in large part been transformed by the quick pace and ubiquity with which technological advancements affect norms of social and aesthetic expressions. The complex, multifaceted process of musical enculturation, wherein the development of specialized perceptual processing for the understanding of pitch and rhythm structures within musical systems in culture, as well as the learning of the pragmatic ways in which music is utilized in different social situations, find themselves involved in processes of remix of past and present imaginaries concerning musical instruments' identity, belonging, form, and function. There is also the relational question that concerns itself with the personal relationships with one's instrument and the relationships with one's art. The form in which one finds, creates, defines, and expresses one's identity through playing and performing a musical instrument in a certain manner is an aesthetic of self, of selfhood in the making. Hence, a familiar playability becomes a conduit and a safe haven, one that emphasizes self-actualization through instrumental language or voicing and artistic expression. For this reason, I have used my experience with various musical instrument languages acquired from masters and gurus of traditional musics in order to speak traditional ideas through tech-fueled hyper-instruments. These hyper-instruments here have as a basis musical playabilities, as in languages and touchabilities, which are then, after being emulated, enhanced, for lack of a better word. By enhanced, I do not mean bettered or improved, but instead mean built upon or expanded. Therefore, someone who plays the tabla, for instance, can use that playability, how that instrument is played, with other sonic outputs which open up new possibilities for expression. For example, a plethora of hyper-instruments have been developed by academics the world around, such as the hyper-shaku border crossing, the e-tabla, the hyper-cello, the digitized Japanese drum aobachi, and the e-sitar, among a myriad of others. Concurrently, many startups have entered the market of instrument augmentation, such as Sunhouse, for instance, who have developed a device called a sensory percussion, which allows for the capturing of the vibrations from drums, and through a software-hardware combination, create a digital overlay on the acoustic sound, turning the drum into an expressive controller. By mapping different sections of the drum skin and body into various MIDI instrument samples or effects, thus providing the drummer with an expansion to the instrument, and provides, as of yet, unparalleled musical control and creative options. A proprietary software analyzes the signal from the sensor and is not only able to distinguish where the drumstick is hitting the skin or the shell, but it is also able to algorithmically determine the strength of the drum hit, allowing the player or producer to control the software's sonic response. Although the software is proprietary, It also functions as a MIDI controller and can send MIDI notes over a bus to any third-party software. This increasing of the expressive potentialities of more traditional instruments raises interesting questions pertaining authenticity when considering the role instruments play in a given culture's musical system. Ideas about authenticity in music permeate much of the academic and historical discourse hailing from Eurological sources, but it is important to note that in many musical systems and cultures, authenticity really is a non-issue. We could even consider that concerns with authenticity arise primarily from a Eurocentric mindset and purview which places more importance on the artist than on the art itself. While on the subject of centrism, one key proposition of this presentation is that with the arrival of the Roland Jupiter 6 and the Prophet 600 in 1982, the development of MIDI instruments became piano-centric in their playability, meaning that one could only play the multiple sound banks in the keyboard as if playing a piano, of course, which made it problematic and perhaps counterintuitive to lay down drum patterns, for instance. To tackle this problem, pad controllers like the Roland Octapad and the Drumcat rolled out circa 1985, thus increasing the variables of playability for MIDI instruments. For instance, with drum pads, the task of playing repeated loops and patterns, like drum rolls, became easier to a more ergonomical instrument design. Both the keyboard and the drum pads have since become ubiquitous, that is, until recent times. Yet now, at a time when expressive limitations of velocity-sensitive MIDI keyboards and pads are considered insufficient for contemporary expectations concerning expressive potentialities, the development of MPE instruments has taken center stage and places us in the crux of a new avenue of development for electroacoustic and digital instruments that, by and large, expand the creative potentialities of artistic performative expression and creative ingenuity. With the increasing capacity to compute, analyze, and translate more gestural interactions and movements, it becomes evident that the 3 decades of piano and pad centrism may be nearing their end. MPE messages specify the MIDI for these 3 dimensions of control, irrespective of the way a controller physically expresses them, thus defining how to configure hardware or software devices to send and receive this multi-dimension control data for optimal interoperability. Going forward, it will be interesting to note how MPE can allow for the emulation of sitar articulations, for instance, through new string controllers, virtual or physical. If we were to take the Indian sitar as our instrument of reference, a series of expressive articulations would need to be covered by both virtual instrument and controller, of which I show but a few in lieu of a simpler, more direct explanation. Kritan, melodic figures produced by actions of the left fingers alone. Mind, notes on the same fret produced by pulling the string with the second finger. Gamak, notes achieved by pulling the string from one note to the next and back again in rapid succession. If we select controllers that exist in the market for comparisons such as, for instance, the triple play wireless MIDI guitar controller and the C-board block, we soon discover that the physical limitations of the guitar neck render the mind inoperable, while the Kritan and Gamak could be expressed to a limited degree. In theory, the soft silicone keys of the C-board block, in turn, are able to fulfill those musical expressions, as one can assume that the 5 dimensions of touch present, which are strike, glide, slide, press, and lift, are able to convey all the sonic articulations produced by the sitar, at which point, provided that the virtual instrument being used as a sound source, such as Native Instruments India, for example, is MPE enabled and also able to emulate the Kritan, Mind, and Gamak, we can arrive at some preemptory conclusions about the viability of transposing the sitar's lexicon by using controllers, including all characteristic articulations. Such an exploratory investigation, of course, would benefit largely from conducting blind tests and ethnographic interviews with various control groups so as to derive conclusions about viabilities, limitations, expressive authenticities, and prejudices involved. The increase of high-fidelity virtual instruments as those developed by Native Instruments, East-West, etc., has not been sufficiently accompanied by the development of musical controllers that can make the most of the sonic potentials made possible therein. Yet controllers, such as the aforementioned seaboard block with its 5 dimensions of touch, or the electroacoustic Korg wave drum, allow for a closer approximation to the playability of traditional instruments. The seaboard block keyboard is a next-generation MIDI controller with unprecedented expressive capabilities that elevates the instrumental form to a post-natural level of expressivity. Not only does this signify that there is a greater instrumental responsiveness from the keyboard, but it also means that the keyboard can be used to play a comprehensive virtual instrument library in a manner previously impossible for a MIDI keyboard. Many virtual instrument libraries, such as the Indian sarod and sitar, cannot be performed to sound genuinely with traditional keyboard sensitivity. The force of the strike on the keys alone does not render the nuances needed to achieve a realistic sounding sarod or sitar performance. Smooth slides between notes, microtonal bends, and quick vibratos being some of the expressive forms needed to approximate those instruments' genuine sonic properties. Thus, in controllers such as the seaboard block, a process of musical instrument design hacking has taken place, decoupling sound from the original instrument and introducing enhancements that potentiate a higher level of expressiveness in performance. The Korg wave drum, on the other hand, as shown in the introduction, allows for an approximation to instrument playabilities that mirror, or at least closely resemble, that of certain hand-played traditional percussion instruments, such as the tabla from the Indian subcontinent, or the African udu, or even the Iranian daf, for instance. The wave drum was engineered with the physicality of percussion instruments in mind and uses revolutionary synthesis technology in order to combine audio signals taken from pickups in the head and rim with data from pressure sensors located underneath the skin to drive DSP-powered algorithms and a PCM sound engine that produce a feel and sound very close to that of an acoustic drum or percussion instrument. Subtle movements of the player's fingers or palm, which can be used to strike, rub, or scratch the head, are faithfully reproduced and augmented, allowing musicians a high degree of expressive power and broad dynamic range without sacrificing the real feel or sonic quality that they require for their performance. For many years, in my career as a musician and composer that somewhat specialized in non-Western instruments and musical genres, I had been keeping a close eye on the development of digital instruments and technologies that would allow for other playabilities. Yet it was as a teacher that I came to fully understand their place in the wider birth of academic inquiry, as their potentials for the emulation of playabilities of traditional instruments can propel musical composition and performance. In my experience as a guest instructor for Berklee Online's World Music Composition Styles, as my students and I navigated so-called exotic musical traditions in mainstream Euro-centric imaginaries in our course matter, I noticed that a concern with traditional authenticity in the production studio did exist, although the outlook on musical traditions from various local center peripheries from whence they came was and is still very much an us and the others, or a West and the rest. Although my students were from different origins and locations around the globe, or rather from various localities, numbering at about 20 each term, as they strive to negotiate musical scales, microtonalities, and odd time signatures through the use of virtual instruments, MIDI controllers, and digital instruments, it became evident that mainstream pop and art cultures of the West had, through globalization, become their predominant musical tradition and leading musical culture, enculturated as imprinted aesthetic canonical forms of melodic, rhythmic, and harmonic structures, despite their many provenances, sometimes hailing from the very same countries we were covering. Therefore, contextualization of musical culture was difficult to achieve as a group, as we negotiated the technical difficulties of using musical technicities familiar to some and not to others, and discussed established musical genres from the world music umbrella taught throughout the course. The course was divided into 12 weeks, the first 11 of which focused on a particular musical style, with the final week being dedicated to a composition in any given style chosen by each student. The objectives were to learn how to compose making musical reference to authentic world music styles in order to convincingly allude to times, places, and peoples, learn how to fuse authentic world styles or elements into their own original and unique compositions, and understand how to construct compositions with building blocks from different traditional genres by utilizing various components such as instrumentation, rhythm, melody, harmony, scales, and ornamentation. Students were asked to analyze musical examples provided in each week's course matter and take note of a few things. They were solicited to look for a harmonic structure or a lack of one, if there were chords and chord progressions present, to determine which instruments played the melody or counter melody, to listen for which scales and rhythms were present, and consider the examples as building blocks used in that given genre, which could later be used in their own compositions to reproduce the musical structures taught each week. In a sense, by jotting down the information for each example, they could use them as templates or recipes for their own music in order to create and infuse their compositions with the essence of a country and genre. Although I felt contextualization was important, it was not required of me going into the job, yet I felt that my students would be better served if they were able to approach their weekly tasks with a little understanding of some social, cultural, and historical elements that factored into the development of each particular world music style studied. This was a task I worked hard to include in every class, an attempt to go beyond the simple data and strategy of doing music by numbers and mathematics. Some musical rules are relative and largely dependent on context, after all. One such example emerged during the class concerning composing in styles from the Indian subcontinent and had to do specifically with the use of microtonalities. In multiple Indian musical contexts, shruti or microtones are often used in the ornamentation of a note or notes, with it being common for microtonal oscillation on single notes. Microtones are commonly used in Hindustani and Carnatic schools of music, both schools being considered non-tempered systems of unequal temperament. In fact, the nature of a rag cannot be recreated or even imagined without first suspending the notion of an equal tempered 12-tone chromatic scale, meaning that pitch accuracy is somewhat negotiable between different rags, where some notes can vary slightly even from one musician to another. Ranging from slightly flat or sharp to very flat or sharp, different microtonal values are often part of characteristic movements in ornamentation. All of this microtonal movement is historically taught through oral traditions that have been passed down from guru to student in musical lineages. Likewise, Middle Eastern maqam, having a much more precise system that includes microtones in a comma system, also rely on oral traditions and given repertoire for the correct use of the microtones. In order to tackle the fact that the MIDI keyboard is based on equal tempered divisions of the octave, we resorted to various strategies which allowed us to retune the scales for a more authentic sonority. We discussed at length what role different controllers could have in allowing them to record MIDI performances with more genuine outcomes, also how we could step away from the DAW and the sequencing page to try to put our compositions together in a more organic manner, in an attempt to go from writing music on the screen to performing it on a controller. The utilization of grid controllers, such as the Ableton Push, among others, permit for a greater flow in contemporary production settings and processes of musical composition, exemplifying how musical creativity is being transformed in the 21st century by the development of better tools and greater control. With grid controllers, not only can rhythmic, melodic, and harmonic patterns be composed with a more intuitive visual interface, but also the rearrangement of parts is facilitated, permitting for an easier and faster way to experiment with musical arrangement. You may wonder, with so many traditional instruments around me and after having spent decades learning how to express myself through them, why have I opted to focus my efforts on a presentation that concerns itself with how the field of digital and electroacoustic instruments is beginning to catch up with the expressions of more traditional forms of music? Well, it's because I believe it gives these instruments a renewed voice in contemporary settings and helps to preserve these same voices from within a place of artistic usefulness, as opposed to being lost in a forsaken history or relegated to the sidelines of soon-to-be-forgotten past. If we consider traditional music and instruments as heritage, and heritage as a discursive and performative production of objects, places, and practices, then the remix of heritage that occurs with the development of tradition-based controllers and electroacoustic instruments can be seen as one more level in the performative production of heritage. Many artists arising from the peripheries now negotiate their musical identities into narratives that are inclusive of instrumentation and sonorities from their places of origin, using modern digital instruments. Controller and electroacoustic technology has caught up to the point where a performance with traditional elements can be decoupled from the originating instruments, and this allows for lighter equipment loads on the road, which makes it feasible to bring a panoply of virtual traditional instruments on the road and bring their sounds to the audience. Some finalizing thoughts. Lastly, in my view, new MPE-enabled controllers that are designed with the intent to avoid piano and pad-based playability centrisms may serve as tools for the resurgence of certain traditional forms of musicking that went unexplored in contemporary musics due to technical impossibilities. The possibilities opened by experimentations with shape, form, and function may further musical exploration that defies conventions and paradigms concerning the dichotomy between traditional and contemporary musics. Traditional playabilities with the right tools can resurge from within the depths of world music 2.0. World music 2.0 is a term initially brought to the fore by Thomas Berklee in 2010 and recently repurposed by writer and DJ Jace Clayton. During the aughts, shortly after the turn of the century, blog writers, DJs, and curators toyed with various terms such as global ghetto tech, ghetto pop, cosmopop, world beat, or worldtronica before settling on world music 2.0 in an attempt to define the world music of interactive internet platforms. In a critical appraisal of center-periphery models, Berklee suggested that the contemporary world can be characterized as a model of multiple moderns, swathed in concurring, overlapping, multi-sided modernities by defining world music 2.0 as the product of an increasingly globalized, digitized, urbanized, post-colonial, and postmodern world. I leave you with an example of remixing or recycling traditional playabilities into new voicings as allowed by modern technology. Thank you.